Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Jeff Peterson looks at the USDA's October crop report. Dave Aiken describes the class action lawsuit against Syngenta. Michael Scuse talks about young and beginning farmers. And Chris Proctor discusses herbicide restrictions for grazing cover crops. In late November and early December, Market Journal will be presenting a series of meetings across Nebraska in collaboration with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Department of Agricultural Economics. The Market Journal Roadshow will focus on the general ag outlook and management decisions for farmers and ranchers. Our first location will be Monday, November 28th in Kearney, followed by Tuesday, November 29th in Sidney. We'll stop in Norfolk Thursday, December 1st, and finish in Lincoln on Friday, December 2nd. Featured speakers include Tina Barrett from Nebraska Farm Business, Inc., and Nebraska Extension's Jay Parsons, Brad Lubin, Corey Walters, and Al Dutcher. The Nebraska Department of Ag will also discuss survey results regarding farm finances in the state. Each event will last about 3 hours and is free to attend. However, we do request pre-registration through the Market Journal website. Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. U.S. farmers are harvesting a soybean crop that could be nearly 9% larger than the country's biggest ever. In its October crop report released Wednesday, the U.S. Department of Agriculture increased this season's soybean output forecast to almost 4.3 billion bushels. 4 of the nation's top 5 growing states are expected to produce record yields, including a state average of 61 bushels per acre in Nebraska. The agency's estimate for corn was slightly lower than September's number, but it would still be a record. We talked with Jeff Thursday afternoon and started by looking at the USDA's latest projections.
You know what's really interesting, Jeff, this is the first time that I can remember that actually the average trade guess was the same for both. 173.4 and a 51.4 nailed them both. Brought the corn yield down from a 174.4 and actually higher than where we were last year, though, to 168.4. But they're pretty optimistic on yields in Nebraska, even though they are coming down. A 181 is what we're looking at, but that came down from a 184, but that's still off the last year to 185. But overall, it looks like the corn yields are going to be off a little bit, but over on the bean side, that 51.4, that compares to a 50.6 last month, compared to a 48 last year, and we thought beans were really pretty good last year. Nebraska numbers, they keep bringing them up. 61 bushels the acre, brought that up from a 59, and we were 58 last year. So overall, bean yields look good. Corn yields going to be down, but I think the Nebraska yields actually are going to be down more than what we're going to see across the rest of the nation.
How do these numbers impact the balance sheet?
Yeah, as we dig into them, there was a lot of changes to kind of take into account. As you look at it, we ended up bringing up ultimately the beginning stock number 22 million. Then we had some changes in there. 400,000 more acres planted was an adjustment, up 200,000 on the harvested. When we brought our yield down, it still meant that our total supply was down about 14 million bushels. We did bring up exports 50 million. Ending stocks came down 64 million bushels to 2.32 billion. A big number compared to the 1.738 last year, Jeff, but overall, at least it was smaller on corn.
In soybeans, though?
Yeah, and the soybeans, a little bit different. Beginning stocks were up 2. Production ended up coming up 70 million. But because of the problems that South America had, demand did come up another 40 million on exports, but that still left our carryout stocks 30 million bushels higher. at $395 million compared to $197 million last year.
It was interesting, markets were initially up after that report and then they closed lower, and today they were up quite well across both markets.
I know, it's interesting on beans. Beans actually traded higher early coming into the morning break, then traded lower, then we came back higher. I think really what it says is there's still some uncertainty out there. The uncertainty is about the bean side. There's some in the industry still think we could see a bigger bean number yet. Our personal opinion as a company though is that we do think we've put in our harvest lows, and I think we will see a gradual grind higher out of here.
What's the USDA expecting for production in Argentina and Brazil?
Yeah, you know, those numbers came out, 83.5 million on the corn side for Brazil compared to 82.5. But here's the kicker, they were 67 million metric tons last year, so we do have more corn that will be coming on. 102 million metric tons on the beans versus a 101, and that was 96.5 million bushels last year. So bringing up Brazil, Argentina was unchanged from last month, but 36.5 million compared to 28 last year. And over on the bean side, 57 million metric tons versus 56.8 last year.
Tell me, back in this country, what harvest progress looks like across the country.
Jeff, in all the years I've been doing this, I would say this is the most variable that I've ever seen. As you kind of dig into it, it just depends on where you're at, really. 35% corn nationally, that compared to 38% last year and 38% on our average, but Nebraska is way behind that. 23% harvested, and that actually compares to 23% last year, but we should be somewhere closer to about 30%. Over on the bean side, we're sitting at about 44% harvested, 56% last year, but that should be closer to about 50% nationally. We're the same place in Nebraska at 44%, but we were 50% last year, but we should be closer to about 53%. So harvest is lagging behind.
What's your price forecast here for corn and soybeans?
Yeah, we think going forward from here over the next 2 to 3 months, you know, we should be up in that 370 to 390 area on corn and getting close to the $10 area on beans. We think is very achievable. Anything beyond that is going to take some problems coming out of South America.
How do you use that for selling strategies in a couple of different situations, I'm sure, in farms across the state?
Yeah, the best way I like to break it down, if you've got bushels you haven't sold and you bring them into the elevator, if they're going to charge you a minimum fee that's probably 10, 15 cents a bushel, just go ahead and put the bushels on storage or delayed pricing. If they're going to charge you that higher price or for delayed pricing, then just go ahead and put them on a basis contract. And I'd do that same thing on both the corn and the bean side. We think there'll be a better pricing opportunity down the road on both the basis side and the future side at a later time.
Next week, Elaine Cubb will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. Corn farmers across the country can now be part of a class action lawsuit against Syngenta. A federal district court judge in Kansas has certified 1 national class and 8 state classes in a lawsuit alleging China's rejection of U.S. corn imports hurt corn prices. China began to refuse American corn late in 2013 after it says it found unapproved Syngenta GMO seed varieties. Nebraska Extension Ag and Water Law Specialist Dave Aiken says this state's farmers will begin receiving written notice informing them they are automatically included in the Nebraska Producer Class and the National Producer Class. He says farmers may opt out of the lawsuit if they want to. We talked with Dave earlier this week and began by asking for background on the litigation.
Syngenta made some GMO corn varieties available that had not gotten approved in China, and when they showed up in some corn shipments to China in 2013, China rejected the shipments. Corn prices dropped, and corn farmers and others involved in the corn trade sued Syngenta, saying that that's, you know, kind of China's rejection is what caused the price to drop.
The relevant timely issue now is that it is a class action lawsuit. What does that mean?
That's right. It's just recently been certified. That means that instead of having dozens of lawsuits against Syngenta all over the country, there'll be one lawsuit, and that all the members in the class, that will be their day in court with Syngenta.
Who's included in this Syngenta producer class then, Dave?
Okay, it's all U.S. corn producers who priced their corn after November 18th, 2013, and then who did not purchase the Viptera or Duracade corn seeds, and those are the 2 Syngenta varieties that China rejected in 2013.
There's a national class and there's a state class. Which states are involved?
Okay, mostly in the Midwest, Arkansas, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Ohio, and South Dakota. And the reason those state classes were established is because in those states, state law gives the farmers a legal cause of action against Syngenta. So for those classes, they can sue Syngenta based on state law as well as on federal law.
If I'm a member of a class, what are my options?
The lawyers who have been authorized by the judge to represent the class in this lawsuit will be sending out, under the judge's supervision, information to all the members of the class. And this will happen in the next couple of months. And so you'll get this big bundle of stuff. It'll tell you all about the lawsuit, tell you about if you don't want to participate, what you have to do to get out of the lawsuit, what the deadline for getting out of the lawsuit would be, and that kind of stuff.
Why would I want to get out of it?
Well, some people want to sue Syngenta themselves. They don't want to be, so they want to have their own day in court, not be part of the class. Some people don't want to have anything to do with it at all, but I suspect that most people will be happy just to be in the class, and if they win something, hopefully they'll end up with a little check in the mail.
Right. What happens if this lawsuit wins?
Well, I saw one so-called independent analysis of what the damages were, and it came out to about $0.10 a bushel for corn farmers. That was not without the legal fees taken out and stuff like that. If you take that out, that will probably drop maybe closer to a nickel based on that estimate. So it's not going to save the farm. It's not going to it's not going to make you a millionaire. So
these are producers. A quick aside for agribusinesses. What are their options here?
Well, there is a separate attempt to get a agribusiness class certified, and I suspect that since the corn farmer's been certified, I'm sure they will for the elevators and grain transporters and so forth.
I'll close with this. What happens next?
Well, Syngenta has indicated that it's at least considering appealing the judge's ruling, and so if it goes on appeal, then that'll slow everything down. But if there is no appeal, could have a trial within a year.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to more resources about this case from Texas A&M University and Iowa State University. Of the principal farm operators in the United States, the 2012 Census of Agriculture showed there were nearly 3 times as many farmers aged 65 and above as there were aged 44 and below. A 2014 study from the U.S. Department of Agriculture showed the average age of the principal landlord in the country was nearly 67 years old, and 45% of those landlords had never farmed. U.S. Deputy Secretary of Agriculture Michael Scuse says the challenge of acquiring and retaining young farmers isn't unique to any area of the country. Scuse spoke on the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's East Campus in September for one of the USDA's forums on land tenure and the next generation of agriculture. We spoke with him before the event.
Well, we're doing a total of 6 beginning farmers and land use forums across the United States. We started 2 weeks ago in Arkansas with the very first one, and here at the university is our second one. We've got a great panel lined up for the forum, so we're excited. I think it's going to be well attended. I'm thinking we're going to get some really good information from the panelists and from those participating today on the land use forums. We need to look at that next generation.
Tell me about some of the trends of the average American farmer.
Well, when you look at the average age of the American farmer, they're 58 years old. And our farmers and ranchers are going to continue to age. We need to find ways to get that next generation involved in agriculture. And when you look at land use, 10% of the land in the United States is going to change hands over the next 5 years. How do we go about getting that land into those young and beginning farmers? What can we do to help? What needs to be done to make sure that we've got that next generation involved in agriculture?
What role is that transition playing in trying to get some of those younger farmers back?
Well, at USDA, we've looked at different things throughout the administration of President Obama with Secretary Vilsack's leadership to look at ways that we can make it easier for young and beginning farmers to get involved. If you look at what NRCS did with the high tunnel houses and how many of those that we've put up to help people get started in agriculture. We've made changes to our crop insurance program as well to help young and beginning farmers be able to afford to get into the program and be able to get their yields adjusted to a place where crop insurance works for them. If you look at our loan portfolio at the Farm Service Agency, and if you're looking at now 2/3 of our loans now go to disadvantaged as well as young and beginning farmers. So there's an effort in every area of USDA to help that next generation. So what else? So the reason we're doing these, what else can be done? How else can we help, or what can the private sector do, or government or state governments do to help get that next generation involved?
I'm wondering, a lot of the landowners that we have across the country right now, there's a good portion that don't farm, have never farmed. Are we seeing that land is more of an investment asset rather than part of a family-owned business or part of the farm anymore?
Well, definitely. And when you look at the investor, they're absentee investors. They don't know or understand agriculture and what it takes to get involved in agriculture today. So there's a huge difference with the investor coming in and owning the land versus somebody who currently owns the land who may be retired, who fully understands agriculture and what it takes to be successful. So there is a disconnect there. So how do we change that?
We see the problem, or at least the challenge here in Nebraska with that. How similar is the challenge in rural areas across the country?
It's the same across all of the United States. I don't care if you're farming in the Northeast, you know, with the dairy operations, or if you're in fruit and vegetables in the Southeast, or grain production and cattle here in the Midwest, and fruit and vegetables in the West Coast. It's the same across the whole country. We have an issue on getting that land into the hands of that next generation and getting them involved in agriculture. So, you know, again, looking at ways that we can make that happen.
Is part of that also trying to revitalize those smaller communities, those really rural areas of the country?
Well, definitely. I mean, if you go back and you look at what happened to the United States in 2008, 2009 with the decline of our economy, if you look at the areas that went through that period of time and came out in the best shape, it was our small rural communities. And it was because of the strength of agriculture. We had, you know, good prices, everything was going in the right direction, and that helped our rural communities weather that financial storm better than our larger communities across the United States. So, you know, agriculture, especially getting that next generation involved, is very important to keep those small rural communities, help them survive and keep them thriving. You know, I, as a farmer myself and from a small community in Delaware, you know, I like to think that those small communities are the backbone of our country.
What advice would you give to a young farmer who's trying to start out and at this point needs a lot of collateral to try to get in the game?
Well, there's a couple things. Number one, they can visit their local Farm Service Agency office. Look at the loan programs that we have available through the Farm Service Agency and take advantage of those. The next thing, that the advice that I would give them, go talk to somebody who's in the business today. Go talk to that older farmer or rancher. Listen to them. There's a lot of knowledge out there, a wealth of information to be had by going and visiting with those farmers and ranchers in your community, asking them about the upsides and the downsides to agriculture and what you need to do to survive. They're there today because they found a way to survive. So you can go get a lot of information for those producers that are still in the business today.
You can find more USDA resources about young and beginning farmers through a link on the Market Journal website. The October Nebraska Farmer says for years, dry edible bean growers in Nebraska have used specialized cutting equipment to harvest their crop in windrows. This month's magazine says there's now a budding interest among farmers in the Panhandle to direct harvest dry beans as a way to reduce passes in the field, save time, and avoid the risks associated with beans exposed to the elements. Brothers Steve and Trent Benzel have been direct harvesting Great Northern beans and pinto beans on their farm near Alliance for 8 years. You can read about some of the tips and insights the Benzels offer in the October Nebraska Farmer. We talked this summer on Market Journal about how producers can use cover crops as a forage option. But if you're going to do that, Nebraska Extension weed management educator Chris Proctor says you must be aware of herbicide label rotation restrictions from the previous corn and soybean crops because of the potential risks to grazing animals. We talked with Chris recently at UNL's Havelock Farm on the northeast corner of Lincoln and started by discussing plant-back restrictions.
So certainly thinking about plant-back restrictions, we're thinking about how long an herbicide is in the soil, how long it sticks around, and how that might affect the next crop you're trying to plant. So it could affect any crop. So if you're going from corn to soybeans, there's certain herbicides that have a long enough residual that you wouldn't want to plant soybeans after, or you wouldn't want to use that herbicide because it would affect your soybeans. So thinking about cover crops, it's that same idea, but we're trying to crowd that timing even a little bit closer. So if you want to put it right after your corn crop, you got to think about that herbicide you use in the spring. How long is that residual, and is it going to affect that cover crop that I'm putting down?
Can you describe how it could affect the crop, what actually happens in the plant there?
Sure. Different crops are going to have different levels of sensitivity to an herbicide, and different herbicides are going to affect crops differently. But if it's a soil residual herbicide, usually it'll probably prevent your crop from coming up. So a lot of times you might just have reduced emergence of your cover crop, or it might not come up at all, and so it might look like just a crop failure.
We've talked this year about producers using cover crops not necessarily for cover, but for cover and grazing purposes. Is there anything to keep in mind there?
Absolutely. So that's one of the things we talk about quite a bit, is if you really want to get the maximum benefit out of your cover crop, if you can graze it, that's an ideal situation. But when you think about cover crops and grazing, suddenly herbicide restrictions become extremely important. So we always talk about following the label, and we're thinking about herbicides and label restrictions. Using cover crops for grazing, we absolutely have to follow the label restrictions.
When you're talking about grazing and using a spray, not necessarily on that crop, but the previous crop, can you go more into the restrictions there?
Yeah, so one thing, a really important distinction to make when you're thinking about grazing restrictions on a label is that restriction only applies to the crop to which the herbicide was sprayed. So if you're talking about an herbicide sprayed to a corn crop, the grazing restriction on the label, so those 30, 45-day grazing restrictions, that's only applying to that corn crop. So you have to wait 45 days before you can graze your corn. That doesn't apply to the cover crop because the herbicide wasn't applied to the cover crop. So now you have to use a rotation restriction as opposed to a grazing restriction for the cover crop. And that's a really important distinction to make.
So that means you can graze it then within that 45 days?
You can graze the corn because the corn was sprayed. You cannot graze the cover crop. It would be a separate restriction that you'd have to follow, and typically it's going to be longer.
How do you develop a weed program or a weed management program here that allows you to try and encompass all of your needs?
So when you're thinking about the weed program, and you have to take into account all the crops that you want to incorporate in your system, I think is number one. So you got to think out ahead a little bit, and so trying to use herbicides. And there's some herbicides that are going to be more forgiving to those shorter rotation restrictions, and we actually have a NEB guide that we published recently talking about some of the rotation restrictions, some herbicide options that have a short enough window that you could rotate 2 cover crops and still be able to graze some of those cover crops.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to that NEB guide Chris mentioned if you're interested in learning more about this issue. Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. And of course, during this past week, we had a couple precipitation events, pretty much light in regards to what we typically would receive at this time of the year. And they were underplayed by the models that were moving them out during the midweek period and showing most of Kansas having the best chance for some light shower activity, actually seeing that move toward the north. The good news or bad news, depending on how you want to look at it, is we did have some hard freeze conditions across the vast majority of the state, south central, southeast pockets of those areas. Did not get completely down to hard freezing area, but they did get frost conditions. So this should help, at least in terms of the soybean harvest. As of Sunday, we had about 44% of the crop harvested, and one of the main detriments was that we were dealing with green stem issues and some residual impacts of the heavy precipitation from 2 weeks ago. It looks like as we move forward in time over this next 7-day period, getting past today, we look like we're going to be relatively dry for the extended period, and that will help aid in the harvest activity. Corn is around 23% harvested. We would expect that to pick up dramatically once the soybean harvest is complete. Now, according to the upper air models, if we go to it today, what we are looking at is this trough of the western United States ejecting energy out, and we're seeing some high cloudiness associated with this, but we don't expect much in the way of precipitation as the mountains strip that moisture out. By tomorrow, we see this trough diving. We also see a ridge in advance of it, so that's going to start to warm our temperatures up. We're going to have a nice weekend. And as we get into the day on Monday, we're going to basically see this trough ejecting out, and that might lead us to some precipitation to the south, and it deepens as it moves to the east of us, and that's going to pull some more cold air down into our region. But it looks like most of what we're dealing with is high cloudiness, maybe just a shot of light precipitation as we get later into the week, and we'll see this ridge start to build in. This will also bring some freezing temperatures to those that have not got it, and we'll see this ridge in place, and it looks like it's going to hold off at least until the 27th of the month as we see this northwest flow ridging pattern basically staying stationary. So good news is that if we can get past this next 24-hour period, we do have an extended period of dry conditions that will promote good harvest activity. In terms of precipitation, if you look at the western United States, you can see that most of the precipitation is coming onshore in the Pacific Northwest, and that will basically remain in place. So they're going to see some tremendous volumes of precipitation, probably some localized flooding. The only other area of good precipitation is in the northeastern United States. Now, as we get into Monday, we'll start to see some of that moisture trying to make it into the central plains, but it looks like most of it's going to eject to the north of us and impact the Great Lakes. So once again, that's why we're calling for good conditions for harvest activity. We do notice that there is a little precipitation showing up as we get into the Wednesday, Thursday time frame, but it's very isolated. We'll keep track of this because this might actually increase as we go forward in time. So the best chance for precipitation as we get past this weekend will be next Thursday into Friday morning. The 8 to 14 day forecast indicates that we will see above normal temperatures as that high pressure system remains in place and blocks the movement of that low coming into the central plains. And in terms of precipitation, with that high pressure system, that low ejecting out the energy, most of the moisture will remain to the east of us as it pulls up that Gulf moisture. So for us, it looks like normal to below normal precipitation from next Thursday to the following Tuesday, and that will continue the excellent harvest activity weather for the state of Nebraska.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on the USDA's October crop report, Syngenta litigation, land ownership for beginning farmers, and herbicide carryover on cover crops. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Next week, Elaine Cubb will be our corn and soybean market analyst, and Julie Peterson will discuss Cry 1F protection against western bean cutworm. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.